3 armed security guards pounding on my door at 6 a.m. was not how I planned to start my vacation. "You have 48 hours to vacate this property," they growled, shoving eviction papers in my face. Little did they know I was about to uncover their boss's $2 million mistake. Let me know where you're watching from, because this isn't just my fight. It's for every homeowner who's ever been pushed too far. I'd inherited my grandfather's cabin at Pinewood Lake, Minnesota, just 3 months earlier. Growing up, I'd spent every summer there until I was 15, when my parents divorced and our family traditions dissolved into awkward holiday rotations. Grandpa Porter passed away last winter, at 92, and I hadn't visited the cabin in nearly 20 years. As a forensic accountant, I rarely took vacations, but after a particularly brutal tax season, I decided it was time to reconnect with those childhood memories and check out my inheritance. The drive up to Pinewood Lake was therapeutic. 3 hours of watching concrete give way to farmland, then dense pine forests reflecting in dozens of small lakes. I'd forgotten how the air smelled different here, crisp and charged with pine sap and lake water. When I finally turned down the gravel road leading to the cabin, something in my chest loosened. The familiar curve of shoreline appeared through the trees, and there it was, the modest A-frame that had featured in so many of my childhood memories. The cabin was exactly as I remembered. Knotty pine walls that smelled like campfire and nostalgia, the slightly sagging couch where Grandpa and I had played endless card games during rainy days, the collection of fishing lures gathering dust on the mantel. The first evening I sat on the deck with a beer, watching the sunset paint the lake orange and purple. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. I was home. I fell asleep planning all the repairs I'd make over the coming weeks, replacing the worn deck boards, fixing the leaky kitchen faucet, maybe even building that boat dock Grandpa had always talked about. Then came the banging on my door at dawn. 3 men in security uniforms, with uncomfortable-looking sidearms and expressions that suggested they enjoyed this part of their job. "Carwin Porter?" the tallest one asked, consulting a clipboard. "We represent the Pinewood Lake Homeowners Association. This property has been found in violation of community ordinances and boundary regulations. You're trespassing on HOA land." He handed me a thick envelope. "You have 48 hours to vacate and remove all personal property or face legal consequences and a $25,000 fine." I stood there in my pajama pants, clutching my coffee mug, completely blindsided. "There must be some mistake," I stammered. "My grandfather owned this cabin for over 50 years. The guards just shrugged. "Take it up with Ms. Clark," the tall one said as they walked away. HOA office opens at 9. I watched them climb into a gleaming white SUV with Pinewood Lake Community Association emblazoned on the side in tasteful navy lettering. This was clearly not the same laid-back lake community I remembered from childhood. Still in shock, I walked down to the small dock that extended from my property into the lake. My grandfather's old rowboat was still there, covered with a tarp. The weathered wood of the dock planks felt familiar under my bare feet. I'd spent countless hours here with my fishing rod, legs dangling over the edge, listening to Grandpa's stories. How could anyone claim this wasn't our property? As I stood contemplating this surreal situation, an elderly man approached from the neighboring property. "You must be George's grandson," he said, extending his hand. "Shanley Maddox. Your grandpa and I were fishing buddies for 40 years. Shanley's weathered face creased with concern as I explained the morning's events. He shook his head grimly. "That'd be Doris Clark's doing. She took over the HOA 3 years ago and has been on a power trip ever since. Started this fancy development company and has been trying to push out all the original cabin owners. Your grandfather fought her tooth and nail before his health declined." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I think that's what finally wore him down." I spent the rest of the morning poring over the eviction documents, trying to make sense of legal jargon that seemed deliberately obtuse. The notice claimed my cabin encroached on community property by nearly 50 feet, and that my illegal occupation constituted a safety hazard and property value threat. It was bureaucratic nonsense designed to intimidate, but it was working. My stomach churned with anxiety as I imagined being forced from my grandfather's home at gunpoint. Later that afternoon, while inspecting the dock, I noticed something odd. There were fresh scratches on the posts and signs that several boats had been tied there recently. Did someone use this dock while the cabin was vacant? I asked Shanley, who was puttering in his garden. He snorted. "Oh yeah. Doris has been renting out premium lake access spots to weekend tourists at $200 a pop. Your dock is prime real estate. Deep water, great fishing. She's probably made thousands off it since your grandpa passed. My shock turned to indignation. Not only were they trying to steal my property, but they'd been profiting from it while my grandfather's body was barely cold. That night, I examined the eviction papers carefully. The attached property survey showed boundaries that didn't match my memories. According to their map, my cabin encroached on HOA common land by nearly 50 feet, and the lakefront wasn't part of my property at all. Something felt very wrong. As I was putting the papers away, I noticed a folder had fallen from the bookshelf. The label read, Pinewood Lake, Original Survey, Keep Safe, in my grandfather's precise handwriting. Inside was a yellowed survey from 1963, property deeds, and a small journal. Why had my grandfather hidden these documents? And why did they show boundaries drastically different from the HOA's claims? The next morning, I drove into town to make copies of everything I'd found. My grandfather's documents showed that his property extended all the way to the lake and included nearly 70 feet of shoreline, significantly more than the HOA was acknowledging. The journal contained meticulous notes about property boundaries, local ordinances, and what appeared to be a long-running dispute with previous HOA leadership. My grandfather had been extraordinarily thorough, perhaps because he'd spent 40 years as a land surveyor. The most revealing entry was from 5 years ago. New HOA president, D. Clark, visited today, offered to buy my lot for development, price insultingly low. When I declined, she mentioned new community regulations coming, implied my property might be non-compliant soon, taking precautions. This single note explains so much about the current situation. When I returned to the cabin, a woman in her early 30s was examining my property line markers with a frown. She wore hiking boots and carried a professional-looking camera. "Can I help you?" I called out, immediately on guard after yesterday's confrontation. She turned, surprised, then smiled and extended her hand. "You must be Carwin. I'm Era Finley, environmental lawyer and your closest neighbor to the north. Shanley mentioned you were having HOA trouble. I thought I'd introduce myself since we might be allies." Over coffee, Era explained she'd moved to Pinewood Lake 2 years ago after inheriting her aunt's cabin. Doris showed up a week after I moved in, claiming my dock violated some arbitrary new regulation. When I pointed out it had been there for 30 years, she suddenly discovered that my shed was 6 inches over the property line and threatened a $10,000 fine. Her eyes hardened. I fought back. Now she mostly leaves me alone, but focuses on easier targets. Eric glanced through my grandfather's documents, her eyebrows rising. "These original surveys are gold," she said. "According to these, you own far more land than they're acknowledging, including that entire cove where the new community dock is being built." She tapped her finger on the survey. "Land boundaries don't change without legal documentation. Either they have newer surveys that supersede these, or they're trying to steal your land." "Why would they want this specific property?" I asked. Era's expression turned serious. "Location. Your lot has the deepest water access and the best view of the lake, perfect for a luxury development." She pointed toward the far shore where construction equipment was visible. "Doris's company is building high-end condos there, but they need more waterfront for their marina. Your grandfather refused to sell, so," she shrugged, "create violations, force you out, buy the property for pennies on the dollar at a distress sale." That afternoon, a white SUV with Pinewood Lake HOA emblazoned on the side pulled up. A woman with impeccable blonde hair and a cream-colored suit stepped out, flanked by 2 men with clipboards. I recognized her from the community website, Doris Clark, HOA president and local real estate developer. She didn't bother introducing herself, just walked straight to my deck, snapping photos. "Mr. Porter," she called out briskly, "we're conducting our daily inspection. Your deck railing violates safety code, and that boat needs to be registered with the HOA. Also, we've installed security cameras for community safety." She pointed to a small camera now mounted on a tree at the edge of what she claimed was my property line, aimed directly at my cabin. I stepped forward, maintaining a polite smile. "Ms. Clark, I believe there's some confusion about my property boundaries. I have the original surveys that show—" She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Those outdated documents were superseded years ago. The community has evolved, Mr. Porter. If you'd attended the annual meetings, you'd know that." She handed me a packet. "Here's our current regulations and a violation notice for unauthorized parking. That'll be $200, due within 30 days. I stood my ground. I'd like to see the documentation that supersedes my grandfather's original deed. For a brief moment, Doris's confident facade cracked. That's available at the HOA office during business hours. She recovered quickly, her smile not reaching her eyes. I strongly suggest you come into compliance quickly, Mr. Porter. The fines accumulate daily. As they drove away, I noticed one of her assistants photographing my car, my boat, even the bird feeder hanging from a tree branch. After they left, I called the county assessor's office and discovered that my grandfather had filed for a comprehensive property reassessment just 6 months before his death. The results hadn't been finalized, but they would have the most current official boundaries on record. I also found notes in his journal about Doris's attempts to buy his property for a lakefront revitalization project, offers he'd consistently refused. That evening, I discreetly photographed several HOA board members walking across what my grandfather's documents showed was my land. As I reviewed the journal further, I found a letter tucked inside the back cover. It was from my grandfather to me, dated just weeks before his death. Carwin, it read, I fought them as long as I could, but I'm too old and tired to continue. They'll come after the property when I'm gone. The truth is in the surveys. Don't let them take what's rightfully yours. I should have stood stronger, but perhaps you can finish what I couldn't. The letter brought tears to my eyes. I remembered my grandfather as a strong, principled man. The thought of him being worn down by constant harassment in his final years filled me with a mixture of sorrow and anger. The letter left me with a hollow feeling and fresh determination. Later that night, curious about Doris's real motives, I searched online for her development company. What I found made my blood run cold. Architectural renderings for Pinewood Lake Luxury, a massive development planned for the exact location where my cabin stood. The projected revenue over $2 million. Looking closer at the development plans, I realized why my property was so crucial. The entire project hinged on controlling the cove where my dock stood. It was the only area deep enough for the luxury yacht marina featured prominently in their marketing materials. Without that access, the condos would lose their most valuable selling point. I wasn't just fighting for my cabin. I was standing in the way of Doris's multi-million-dollar project. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from the county records office, just as Doris's landscaping crew was accidentally destroying my garden while maintaining community green spaces. When I opened the envelope, I couldn't help but smile. Grandpa wasn't just being paranoid with all his surveys and documents. He was setting up the perfect trap. The letter from county records confirmed what I had suspected. My grandfather's final property assessment had been completed and officially recorded 3 weeks before his death. The document clearly established boundaries that matched his original survey, not the HOA's claims. It specifically noted the Porter property at 67 Lakeview Drive extends to the natural shoreline with riparian rights to adjacent waters as established in the original 1963 deed. In other words, I owned not just the land to the lake, but had legal rights to the water access as well. Armed with official confirmation, I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting that evening. The community center was a modern building near the lake entrance, all glass and stone, clearly built to impress potential buyers rather than serve the modest cabin community. Inside, about 30 people sat in neat rows, facing a raised platform where Doris and 4 board members presided like a small-town politburo. I sat quietly in the back, observing the dynamics. Doris ran the meeting with ruthless efficiency, cutting off questions and concerns with practiced ease. Several homeowners raised issues about rising fees and selective enforcement of rules, only to be told their concerns would be taken under advisement or addressed in committee. When the floor opened for new business, I stood. I'd like to address the board regarding the boundary dispute concerning the Porter property at 67 Lakeview Drive. Doris's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed. Mr. Porter, property disputes are handled through proper channels, not open meetings. Please submit your concerns in writing. I smiled back. Actually, according to HOA Bylaw 7.3, members may address boundary concerns at open meetings if they impact community resources. Since you've claimed my dock as HOA property and have been renting spaces to non-residents, this qualifies. I held up the county documents. I have official certification from the county assessor, Jordan Williams, confirming that my property extends to the lake and includes 70 feet of shoreline, including the area where you've been collecting dock rental fees." The room erupted in murmurs. A thin man in an expensive suit introduced as Douglas Price, HOA legal counsel, whispered urgently to Doris. I continued, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "Furthermore, I've documented multiple instances of HOA representatives trespassing on my property, vandalizing my garden, and installing surveillance equipment without consent. I'm prepared to file charges if necessary, but I'd prefer to resolve this amicably." Several homeowners turned to look at Doris, whose composure had visibly slipped. She stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned for today. We'll investigate Mr. Porter's claims and address them appropriately." As homeowners filed out, several gave me approving nods or whispered encouragement. One elderly woman squeezed my arm and murmured, "It's about time someone stood up to her." The following morning, I discovered that my water and electricity had been shut off. A notice on my door cited emergency infrastructure upgrades that would take 2 to 4 weeks to complete. When I called the utilities, they informed me the shutdown had been requested by the HOA, who controlled all service connections in the community. That afternoon, I drove into town and purchased solar panels, a water filtration system, and a small generator. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd need to be self-sufficient. Era helped me install the solar panels, shaking her head at the HOA's tactics. Doris pulled the same stunt with the Hendersons last year when they refused to sell. They gave up after 2 weeks without water. As we worked, she shared something interesting she'd discovered. "I've been researching Doris's development plans. There are serious environmental concerns with that condo project. Potential wetland disruption that would never pass a proper environmental impact study. But 3 of the 5 county commissioners who'd approve the permits are investors in her company." "That sounds like a conflict of interest," I said, connecting wires to the battery system. Ira nodded grimly. "Classic small-town corruption. Most people can't afford to fight it. They either sell out or get forced out." She handed me a wrench. "But most people aren't forensic accountants with environmental lawyers for neighbors." Over the next few days, I documented every HOA violation. The unauthorized camera on my property, the service disconnection, the daily inspections that involved photographing through my windows. I installed my own cameras, capturing board members deliberately walking across my property, testing doors, and in one case, attempting to look through my windows. Each incident was cataloged, time-stamped, and added to my growing file of evidence. That night, I drove to the county office and filed formal complaints about the HOA's actions, including documentation of the boundary dispute, utility shutoff, and harassment. On my way back, I bought surveying stakes and property markers, which I installed along my actual property line at first light, cutting directly through what the HOA had been calling their community garden, and ending just feet from their prized gazebo. I added small solar-powered lights to make them visible at night. The stakes were a calculated provocation, and Doris's reaction was swift. That afternoon, a courier delivered a cease and desist letter threatening legal action for vandalism of community property and malicious interference with HOA operations. The letter demanded I remove all stakes and pay for damages, warning of a potential $50,000 lawsuit if I didn't comply within 24 hours. I was reviewing my options when I heard a rumbling outside at 5 a.m. A tow truck was hooking up to my car, which was parked in my own driveway. The driver had HOA paperwork claiming my vehicle was illegally parked in a community access area. I rushed out in my bathrobe, blocking the truck. "This is private property. You're committing theft." The driver looked uncomfortable. "Look, man, I'm just doing what the paperwork says. Take it up with the..." After a heated exchange and my threat to call the sheriff, he unhitched my car and left. Standing in the early morning mist, watching the tow truck disappear, something my grandfather wrote in his journal came back to me. The best way to win a rigged game is to change the rules. And I had just discovered rule number 1 of my property deed, the one about water rights that would make Doris choke on her morning latte. My grandfather's documents contained a crucial detail I'd overlooked. The original deed included riparian water rights to the entire cove adjacent to my property. In simple terms, while I owned the physical shoreline, I also had legal rights to control access to the water in that area. This meant the massive community dock that the HOA had constructed, the centerpiece of Doris's rental business and future condo development, technically encroached on my water rights. I verified this with a local attorney who confirmed Minnesota lake property laws were specific about these rights. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. These rights haven't been exercised, but they've never been surrendered either. Armed with this information, I visited Jeffrey Taylor, the harbor master responsible for lake structures and water access. He was skeptical at first, examining my documents with a frown. "These rights haven't been exercised in decades," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But if the county assessor has confirmed your boundaries, then yes, technically that dock would need your permission to remain in place." He sighed. "Ms. Clark won't be happy. That dock brings in significant revenue for the community." News travels fast in small towns. By evening, neighbors were stopping by, some curious, some supportive, others clearly sent to gather intelligence for Doris. One elderly couple thanked me for standing up to the HOA. "They've been bullying people for years," the husband whispered. Another neighbor warned me to watch my back. "Doris plays to win, and she's got friends in the county government." The next day, I discovered that Doris had organized a community meeting without me. Shanley attended and reported back that she'd portrayed me as a city slicker trying to destroy community amenities and drive up everyone's HOA fees. She said if you succeed, they'll have to increase annual dues by 30% to compensate for lost dock revenue. The hostility was palpable when I walked through the community the following morning. Someone had spray-painted celluloid on my mailbox, and I found nails scattered in my driveway. These intimidation tactics only strengthened my resolve. In my professional life as a forensic accountant, I'd dealt with plenty of bullies who used financial pressure to get their way. I spent the next 2 days researching water rights laws and consulting with a water management authority. ERA brought more concerning news. I've been reviewing environmental impact documents for Doris's development. They're claiming minimal shoreline disruption, but their actual plans show major dredging that would destroy fish habitats. They've submitted completely different documents to different agencies. The tourism board documents showed a massive marina requiring extensive dredging, while the environmental impact statement claimed only minor shoreline improvements. Douglas Price, the HOA attorney, had signed off on the falsified documents. On Friday, I sent an official notice to the HOA regarding the dock encroachment, but rather than demanding its removal, I offered a reasonable licensing agreement. They could maintain the dock in exchange for acknowledging my property boundaries and paying a nominal annual fee. Doris's response was to call an emergency HOA board meeting. I attended, armed with all my documentation. The community center was packed, the atmosphere tense. Doris began with a character assassination, describing me as a greedy opportunist threatening community harmony. When I presented my evidence, including the riparian rights documentation, she dismissed it as arcane legal nonsense and refused to even consider the licensing agreement. Mr. Porter is attempting to extort money from this community by exploiting outdated language in a 60-year-old document, she declared. If we allow this precedent, every homeowner with lake access will start charging their neighbors for water rights, property values will plummet, weekend rentals will disappear. Is that what you all want? What happened next surprised everyone. Jeffrey Taylor, who had been sitting quietly with the board members, suddenly stood up. "The documentation Mr. Porter has provided is legitimate," he announced, his voice carrying authority from 20 years as harbor master. "I've consulted with state water management and his claim is valid. We should consider his offer." Doris's face flushed red. "You're out of order, Jeffrey." He shook his head, gathered his papers, and walked out, saying clearly, "No, Doris, you're out of order and I won't be part of it anymore." The room erupted in whispers. Several board members looked uncomfortable. Doris abruptly adjourned the meeting, but the damage was done. As I walked back to my cabin that night, I noticed 3 unfamiliar cars parked outside. What I didn't expect to find was a team of workers inside, removing my furniture and changing my locks. Apparently, Doris had decided to skip the legal process entirely. Big mistake. Huge mistake. I called the sheriff immediately, but was told they couldn't respond until morning. Convenient, since Doris's husband played poker with the sheriff every Thursday. With nowhere to sleep, I spent an uncomfortable night in my car, watching workers carry out family heirlooms and personal belongings. They loaded everything into storage containers labeled Pinewood Development Corp., Doris's company. By morning, new locks had been installed and a security guard was posted at my door. The guard, a young man who looked barely out of high school, seemed uncomfortable with his assignment. "Just doing my job, sir," he mumbled when I approached. "Miss Clark says you're being evicted for multiple violations." I showed him my property documents and the county's letter, explaining the situation. His expression wavered. "Look, I'm just a summer hire. I don't know anything about property disputes, but, he lowered his voice, they took a lot of stuff out last night, personal things. Didn't seem right to me. When the sheriff finally arrived, a full 18 hours after my call, he seemed uninterested in my documentation. Looks like a civil matter to me, he drawled. HOA says you're in violation, you say you're not. Courts will have to sort it out. When I pointed out that breaking and entering was a criminal matter, he shrugged. HOA bylaws give them access rights in case of violations. Take it up with the judge. He drove away, leaving me homeless and helpless. I tried calling several local attorneys, but none would take my case. Conflict of interest, they all said, which I later learned meant they were either on Doris's payroll or afraid of crossing her. I felt the walls closing in. Without access to my cabin or my possessions, with the community turned against me and local authorities unwilling to help, my options were dwindling. For the first time, I considered giving up. I called my mother in tears, something I hadn't done since my divorce 5 years earlier. Maybe it's time to let it go, Carwin, she said gently. Your grandfather wouldn't want you suffering like this. You could sell the property to them and be done with it. Her words hit me hard. Was I being stubborn? Was this fight worth it? I sat in my car, surrounded by the few possessions I'd managed to keep, feeling utterly defeated. That afternoon, Era found me at the local diner, staring into a cold cup of coffee. You're staying with me tonight, she insisted. No arguments. She drove me to her cabin, where Shanley was waiting with several other neighbors. We're not letting Doris get away with this, one woman said firmly. She pulled similar stunts with my brother last year. Shanley nodded. Your grandfather fought her too, son. She wore him down, but you don't have to repeat history. Over bowls of homemade stew, they shared their own stories of Doris's intimidation. One family had been fined repeatedly for excessive garden plants until they finally sold to her company at a loss. An elderly widower had his driveway repeatedly blocked by maintenance vehicles until he gave up and moved to a retirement community. Each story revealed the same pattern: systematic harassment followed by below-market purchase offers from Doris's development company. Why hasn't anyone reported this to authorities? I asked. The uncomfortable silence told me everything. She owns half the county officials, Shanley finally said, and the other half are too scared to cross her. Her husband's family has been here for generations. Old money, old connections. But things are changing. People are getting fed up. Janley handed me a small package. George left this with me before he passed. Said to give it to you if you ever had trouble with the HOA. Inside was an old clock, the kind that would hang on a wall, and a note in my grandfather's handwriting. Sometimes you need to see what happens when you're not looking. When I examined the clock more closely, I discovered it contained a hidden camera, perfectly designed to capture activity in a room without being detected. My grandfather was always 3 steps ahead, Shanley said with a sad smile. He knew they'd come after the property eventually, started gathering evidence years ago, but his health failed before he could use it. He was saving it for you. The thought of my grandfather meticulously preparing for this battle, knowing he wouldn't live to fight it himself, filled me with both grief and determination. That night, after a shower and a real meal, I read more of my grandfather's journal, discovering that Doris had used similar tactics against him: harassment, false violations, and eventually utility shutoffs. The final entries showed a man worn down by constant battle. I'm too old to keep fighting, he'd written, but I've left everything Carwin will need to finish this, if he chooses to stand his ground. The words hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather hadn't given up. He'd been preparing for me to take up the fight. I slammed my fist on the table, startling Era, who was working nearby. Enough, I shouted. They did this to him, but they won't do it to me. The defeat I'd felt transformed into burning determination. I was done being reactive. It was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I filed for an emergency injunction against the HOA, citing illegal eviction, breaking and entering, and theft of personal property. Era used her legal contacts to get us a hearing within 48 hours. Meanwhile, neighbors began coming forward with statements about Doris's bullying tactics and financial mismanagement. I learned that many residents had faced similar harassment, but had been too intimidated to speak up. Using my accounting background, I began examining the HOA financial statements that Shanley had collected over the years. The numbers didn't add up. Community fees had increased by nearly 200% in 3 years, yet infrastructure improvements had decreased. Large sums were categorized as administrative expenses with no further explanation. Most suspicious were regular transfers to a community development fund that didn't appear to fund any actual community projects. We discovered why Doris was so desperate to acquire my property. Her development company was deeply in debt, having overextended on several failed projects. The Pinewood Lake condos represented her last chance to avoid bankruptcy. She'd already pre-sold several units on the promise of exclusive lake access that ran directly through my property. She's essentially running a Ponzi scheme, I explained to Ira and Shanley, using new investor money to cover losses from previous projects. If the condo development falls through, the whole house of cards collapses. Ira nodded grimly. That explains the increasing desperation. She's not just being greedy, she's fighting for survival. While waiting for the hearing, I created a website documenting all HOA violations and my property claims, sharing it with every homeowner. I installed motion-activated sprinklers along my property line, along with legal no trespassing signs. I placed my grandfather's clock camera where it could monitor my cabin, and sure enough, it captured Doris and her workers, returning repeatedly to remove more items and search through personal documents. Most damning was footage of Doris instructing workers to look for property documents while removing family photos and mementos, items with no value except to me. "Take everything that looks important," she said on the recording. "I want this place stripped clean before he gets back in." It was the smoking gun we needed, clear evidence of malicious intent rather than legitimate HOA enforcement. The judge at our hearing was initially dismissive, but the video evidence of Doris's illegal entry changed everything. He issued a temporary restraining order against the HOA, barring them from entering my property or interfering with utilities. Most importantly, he ordered that I be allowed immediate access to my cabin. The sheriff's department, now under judicial order, had to escort me back to my property that very afternoon. The look on the security guard's face when the sheriff arrived to escort me back to my property was priceless. But it was nothing compared to Doris's expression the next morning when she saw what was floating in the lake, the dock sections I'd legally removed overnight, with all their expensive boats now awkwardly clustered in the public marina. Word spread quickly about my legal victory and the dramatic dock removal. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up began reaching out, sometimes with a quick nod at the general store or a whispered "good job" at the gas station. The wall of intimidation was cracking. Daniel Atkins, an HOA board member who had always voted with Doris, contacted me privately. "I can't be publicly associated with you," he whispered over coffee at a diner 20 miles away from Pinewood Lake. "But I've been uncomfortable with Doris's methods for years. I have documents you should see." His hands shook as he passed me a manila envelope. The papers Daniel provided revealed years of financial mismanagement. Doris had been diverting HOA funds to her development company, disguising the transactions as community improvements. Maintenance fees had been collected but never spent on actual maintenance, explaining the deteriorating roads and common areas despite rising HOA dues. Most damning, she had falsified board meeting minutes to approve actions that had never been voted on. "The development company is nearly bankrupt," Daniel explained. "They've been using HOA fees to cover payroll for months. If that gets out, there could be criminal charges." Meanwhile, Doris was growing desperate. My security cameras caught her trespassing multiple times, once attempting to plant evidence of code violations on my property. She filed a countersuit filled with fabricated claims, including that I had threatened HOA members and vandalized community property. At a grocery store confrontation, her hands shook with rage as she hissed, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will bury you." Despite her threats, community opinion was shifting. Jeffrey Taylor provided detailed records of dock rental fees that had never been recorded in HOA financial statements. Several board members began questioning Doris's decisions in public meetings. Even the sheriff started returning my calls. I focused on rebuilding my cabin, repairing the damage done during the illegal eviction. As I worked on replacing broken windows and repainting graffiti-covered walls, neighbors began stopping by to help. An impromptu weekend work party formed, a dozen people bringing tools, lumber, and food. During this time, Era and I grew closer, spending evenings strategizing on her porch. She had moved to Pinewood Lake seeking peace after years of environmental litigation in Chicago, only to find herself pulled into another fight. "Some battles choose you," she said one night, her hand briefly covering mine. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you're standing up. not just for yourself but for everyone she's bullied. To build goodwill, I organized a lakeside barbecue, inviting all neighbors, regardless of whose side they were on. As people relaxed over food and drinks, they shared their own HOA horror stories. An elderly couple fined for having a bird feeder, a single mother's car towed from her own driveway for being unregistered. With each story, the community's resentment toward Doris crystallized. We need to reclaim our community, I told the gathered neighbors. The HOA should work for us, not against us. I saw something powerful emerging, a sense of collective purpose. Pinewood Lake had been a collection of isolated homeowners, each dealing with Doris individually. Now they were becoming a unified community. Through Daniel, I learned that several board members were ready to break with Doris. I prepared a comprehensive settlement offer. I would keep my rightful property and allow the HOA to license dock space through a proper legal agreement, with fees going to actual community improvements rather than Doris's pocket. The proposal included transparency measures that would prevent future abuses. The turning point came when the State Environmental Authority, acting on documentation ERA had provided, suspended all development permits pending investigation into falsified environmental impact statements. Doris's company's stock plummeted, and investors began pulling out of the condo project. At the next HOA meeting, which Doris tried unsuccessfully to cancel, several board members openly questioned her leadership. "We've received concerning reports about financial irregularities," one elderly board member said. "The community deserves transparency about how our fees are being spent." When Doris attempted to adjourn without addressing the concerns, homeowners refused to leave. For the first time, the community stood together against her intimidation. Daniel texted me during the meeting. "Emergency board session called for 7 p.m. tomorrow. She's trying to push through a legal fund to fight you. Time to bring everything you have." That night, I prepared my evidence meticulously. Financial records, video footage, witness statements, and documentation of Doris's systematic harassment of multiple homeowners. As I worked, I felt my grandfather's presence, as if he were guiding my hand. "This one's for you, Grandpa," I whispered. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for 7 p.m. sharp. I wasn't invited, of course, but thanks to Daniel's text updates, I knew exactly when to arrive with my final piece of evidence, the one that would make Doris's entire scheme come crashing down around her designer blazer. I timed my entrance perfectly, walking into the community center just as Doris was urging the board to approve a special assessment, an additional $3,000 per household, to fund legal action against me. The room fell silent as I approached the podium, carrying a thick folder and a small projector. "Before you vote on that assessment," I said calmly, "you might want to see what your HOA president has been doing with your money." Doris tried to have me removed, but board members insisted I be allowed to speak. "We've heard Mr. Porter's allegations for weeks," one said firmly. "It's time we saw his evidence." Doris's face hardened, but she was outnumbered. I connected my projector and began presenting evidence. Financial records showing systematic embezzlement, falsified meeting minutes, and communications with developers that revealed her plan to force out original homeowners and convert the entire lakeshore to luxury condominiums. I displayed side-by-side documents showing how HOA funds had been systematically diverted to Doris's development company. Over the past 3 years, I explained, nearly $700,000 in community fees have been transferred to Pinewood Development Corporation under the guise of infrastructure improvements that were never performed. Shocked murmurs spread through the room as homeowners realized how they'd been manipulated. But the most damning was a recording from my grandfather's clock camera showing Doris and the HOA attorney discussing how to fabricate violations to force me out. "We need that property for the marina," Doris said in the recording. "I don't care what violations you have to create, just get him out. The investors are breathing down my neck." The attorney's response was equally incriminating. "We've pushed the legal boundaries already. Breaking in could expose us to criminal charges." Doris's dismissive laugh was chilling. "Who's going to charge us? My husband plays poker with the sheriff every week." As the evidence mounted, Doris's face went from flushed to ashen. When I played a recording of her instructing workers to change my locks and remove my possessions, a clear criminal act, she suddenly lurched to her feet. "You ungrateful people," she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. "I've carried this community for years. Those decrepit cabins were dragging down property values. My development would have made you all rich." In her rage, she made a fatal mistake. Once the luxury condos are built, property values will triple, pricing out all the riffraff who can't afford to live in a premium community. That was the plan all along. Her voice echoed in the stunned silence as everyone realized she had just admitted to deliberately trying to force out longtime residents for profit. Someone was recording on their phone, and Doris's meltdown went viral in the community message groups within minutes. The board immediately called for a vote of no confidence, removing her as president by unanimous decision. They voted to cancel all eviction proceedings against me and other homeowners, and to initiate a full forensic audit of HOA finances. As Doris stormed out, hurling threats about lawsuits and retribution, the atmosphere in the room transformed. Neighbors who had been intimidated for years were suddenly speaking freely, sharing relief and even laughter. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from Pinewood Lake. Daniel Atkins was nominated as interim president with a mandate to reform the HOA bylaws and restore transparency. In the following weeks, the full extent of Doris's schemes unraveled. The county prosecutor opened an investigation into fraud and embezzlement charges. Her development company collapsed as investors fled and loans were called due. The luxury condo project was permanently shelved. Most satisfying was watching Doris's expensive furniture being loaded into moving trucks as she was forced to sell her lake house to cover mounting legal bills. The new HOA leadership, with Daniel Atkins as interim president, worked with homeowners to develop fair and transparent policies. My property boundaries were officially recognized, and I received compensation for damages and stolen property. Jeffrey Taylor was appointed to oversee a new dock sharing arrangement that benefited the entire community rather than lining one person's pockets. Recovery wasn't immediate. Many homeowners had suffered financial losses from Doris's schemes, and the community's reputation had been damaged. But something remarkable emerged from the crisis: a genuine sense of community. Neighbors who had previously been isolated began working together on improvement projects. The community center, once Doris's fortress, became a true gathering place, with weekly potlucks and game nights. At a lakeside gathering celebrating the new era at Pinewood Lake, I found myself unexpectedly in the spotlight when Daniel asked me to say a few words. Standing before neighbors who had gone from strangers to allies, I proposed the Pinewood property owners' protection, a set of binding bylaws that would prevent any future HOA from abusing power or targeting individual homeowners. The measure passed with overwhelming support. My grandfather loved this lake, I told the gathered community. He fought to protect his small piece of it, but he dreamed of something bigger, a community where homeowners worked together rather than against each other, where rules existed to preserve what makes this place special, not to push people out. I gestured toward the sunset, painting the lake gold and crimson. This is what he was fighting for, what we all fought for. In the months that followed, I decided to make the cabin my permanent residence, converting my city condo into a rental property. Working with ERA and environmental experts, we established the shoreline around my property as a protected conservation zone, preserving it for future generations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very land Doris had tried to develop into concrete and glass would now remain natural forever. Perhaps most meaningful was establishing the Pinewood Legal Defense Fund to help homeowners stand up against HOA overreach, not just at our lake, but across the county. The fund, seeded with the settlement money from my case against the old HOA, would ensure that no one would have to face such battles alone. Your grandfather would be so proud, Shanley told me one evening as we fished from my rebuilt dock. He always said you had the porter's stubbornness. Turns out that's exactly what was needed. ERA and I grew closer as we worked on community projects. What had begun as an alliance against a common enemy blossomed into something deeper. 6 months after Doris's departure, ERA moved her environmental law practice to a small office in town and became a permanent fixture at my cabin. We combined our expertise, her legal knowledge and my accounting skills, to help other communities establish fair HOA practices. 1 year later, we held a community celebration at my cabin. The new dock sharing arrangement was working beautifully, with reasonable fees funding actual improvements. Neighbors who had once been intimidated into silence were now active participants in community decisions. Children played on the shoreline that had nearly become a concrete marina, and older residents shared stories of Pinewood Lake's history with newcomers. As the sun set over Pinewood Lake, casting golden light across the water my grandfather had fought to protect, I raised a toast to his memory. The cabin that had almost been taken from me had become the heart of a reborn community. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about creating something better for everyone. Well, everyone except Doris, who I hear is now managing a mini mall in Nevada. I did send her a housewarming gift, though, a beautifully framed copy of my property survey. I thought she might want to hang it up as a reminder to always read the fine print.